Okay, hi everybody. Let's begin with a round of applause and thanks for John. So the day has been saved. So I would like to introduce Brett Topey. Am I pronouncing your last name?
That's correct,
Yeah,
yes.
Brett Topey. So Brett received his PhD from Brown University, and he's currently a postdoc at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Salzburg. He's interested mainly in issues in epistemology, the philosophy of language, and their interactions. He has published in a number of journals: Erkenntnis, the British Journal of Philosophy of Science, Philosophical Quarterly, twice in Phil Studies, twice in Synthèse, and in Analysis. Quite a lot of his work focuses on issues about analyticity, the a priori, truth by convention, and the epistemology of logic and mathematics. And he also has written on higher order evidence and other issues in epistemology. Today, he's going to be talking to us about issues about analyticity, a priori, and related things. His title of this talk is Pragmatic Accounts of Justification, Epistemic Analyticity, and Other Routes to Easy Knowledge of Abstracta. So, welcome, Brett.
So I've met a lot of you. Thanks everybody for having me and being very kind. I've enjoyed my stay so far. So yeah, let's get started. So what I'm talking about today is an epistemological problem for Platonism, and it's, I think, a familiar problem, but I'm trying to develop it. So we'll get to this in a few minutes, but okay. So as I say, today, what I want to think about is Platonistic theories of abstract objects. Obviously, abstract objects are just numbers, sets, propositions, maybe possible worlds, pick your favorite. And I just want to be clear that here I'm using the term Platonistic somewhat stipulatively. What I'm interested in are views on which abstract objects are both mind-independent and causally inert. That's all I mean when I say Platonism. And Platonistic views are epistemologically puzzling for well-known reasons, broadly describable this way. So on a minimally naturalist-friendly picture of our place in the world, in particular, a picture on which our cognitive faculties operate causally, as science would indicate, our beliefs do not seem to result from any sort of contact, cognitive contact with mind-independent causally inert objects. So there just doesn't seem to be any mechanism by which we could determine what those kinds of objects are like. And the question then is, of course, how can we be in good epistemic shape with respect to those objects? Okay. So for example, you have a belief that 5 is a prime number, and if Platonists want to not be skeptics, they have to insist that beliefs like this are in some sense in good epistemic standing. What I mean when I say good epistemic standing, it doesn't really matter. So Platonists, different people will say different things. People find knowledge more important, or justification more important, or some kind of epistemic entitlement most important here. It doesn't really matter for our purposes what the details are going to be. So I'm not going to be very careful about distinguishing among these kinds of epistemological notions. It's just good epistemic shape in some broad sense is what I'm interested in. So if you are a non-skeptic Platonist, then you have to give an account of how it is that our beliefs in this, like belief that 5 is a prime number, can be in good standing. One option is to try to explain how it is that you are in fact in cognitive contact, despite what I said before, with the number 5. For example, by rejecting a naturalistic picture of cognition. But my concern here is with the prospects for a strategy for people who would like to be realists, but also would like to be naturalists. And the strategy is to grant that we are not in cognitive contact with the number 5 or with other abstract objects, but pair your Platonism with a particular sort of epistemological theory, a theory on which your belief is in good standing anyway. And the idea is just to design what I'm going to call an easy knowledge theory for the purposes of this talk. And that's just an epistemological theory on which the good standing of a belief about some part of the world does not require that we be in cognitive contact with that part of the world. Okay. Here's just in case it's not clear how this would work. Here's a bad example of such a theory. A theory on which for a belief to count as justified, all that's required is that it be true. So all true beliefs are justified. Why is this an easy knowledge theory? Because your belief can happen to be true even if you just wildly guessed, right? You don't have to be in cognitive contact with the sun or whatever. The sun is a bad example. We're in cognitive contact with the sun. You don't have to be in cognitive contact with the number 5 to happen to have a true belief about the number 5, right? So, like I said, this is a terrible theory. We're going to return in a minute to how kind of a more plausible, easy knowledge theory might work. The point is that you just have to set up the justification conditions in such a way, or the conditions for some other kind of good standing in such a way that you can meet those conditions without being in cognitive contact with the relevant objects. As we'll see in a moment, appealing to some kind of easy knowledge theory is a very popular strategy here. And the reason is that if you're a non-skeptical Platonist with naturalist inclinations, there are no other options. Okay, so naturalism rules out cognitive contact with mind-independent causally inert objects, but our beliefs about those objects, we're supposing, are in good standing anyway. So you have to have a theory on which you have beliefs in good standing, despite there not being any cognitive contact. But notice, to appeal to an easy knowledge theory in this context is not to answer the worry about our inability to determine what abstract objects are like. It's to dismiss that worry as epistemologically irrelevant, right? There was a question about like the mechanisms by which we could find out about abstract objects. And the answer here is just kind of engineering our epistemological theory so we don't have to think about that question. That's what's happening. And if you're like me, you might be suspicious of that move, which brings me to the main claim that I'm going to be defending in this talk, which is if our goal is to make a genuine case for non-skeptical Platonism, the strategy of appealing to an easy knowledge theory is just hopeless, despite its popularity. That's the point. To clarify what I'm going to be claiming, I don't want to claim that these easy knowledge theories that I'm going to describe are incorrect. I'm open to the idea that some such theory might be right. What I'm going to argue instead is that even if some easy knowledge theory can deliver the result that our beliefs about abstract objects are initially prima facie in good standing, that good standing is inevitably going to be defeated by the kinds of considerations that I can bring up. And if that's right, then if you have naturalistic inclinations, you cannot hope to avoid skepticism just by finessing your epistemological theory. That's not a way to go. Instead, you have to insist on a non-Platonistic metaphysical theory. So you have to grant that abstract objects are not both mind-independent and causally. That's the structure of it. Okay, so what I want to do is just begin by exploring some of the ways that theorists might try or have tried to implement this strategy of appealing to an easy knowledge theory, a theory where we don't have to be in cognitive contact with abstract objects in order to have beliefs about them that are in good standing. Okay, so returning to radically externalist epistemology, maybe a slightly more plausible version than the one I suggested before, maybe the simplest kind of easy knowledge theory that's sort of minimally plausible is some form of reliabilism. Okay, and so reliabilism has been around since at least the 70s, but Goldman in 1999 and Kornblith in 2004 have applied it specifically to sort of the case of our arithmetical knowledge, for instance. So here's how it would work in this particular case. According to reliabilism, the main condition that a belief has to satisfy in order to be in good standing is just for it to have been reliably formed. And I'm going to be vague about that because there's lots of different forms of reliabilism. So it's okay. It doesn't matter exactly how we specify that. The claim then is that the ways in which we form mathematical beliefs by doing calculations and constructing proofs are extremely reliable. Okay, that's the claim. And the thing is, those ways of forming beliefs do not work by putting us into cognitive contact with mathematical objects. Right? We're just doing some symbol manipulation, fundamentally. So reliabilism can deliver the result that our mathematical beliefs are, at least initially, in good standing, despite our lack of contact with mathematical objects. Right. So that's one way, one kind of easy knowledge theory you might have. Another possibility, and one that appeals to some version of Crispin Wright's notion of epistemic entitlement of cognitive project specifically. And he's not the only person who said things like this, but we're going to use his formulations here to sort of explain how this might go. The details again here are not super important. I just want to give you sort of a feel for how people have tried to implement this kind of approach. So, okay, so what Wright says is, look, as rational beings, we have a certain kind of right, the right to undertake cognitive projects absent reason to think that they will be ineffective. And he has other conditions about, like, you don't want to take on projects that are immoral and stuff like that, but that's not important for our purposes here. And a cognitive project here is just a kind of, he says it's a question and a method for answering that question. So it's just like a form of inquiry, basically. And the thing about cognitive projects is that they have presuppositions, and these are just propositions such that to doubt them would rationally commit one to doubting the significance or competence of the project. So what he says is, maybe we have some proposition that's a presupposition of a project that we have a right to undertake. And let's suppose also that trying to justify that proposition would lead to an infinite regress of justificatory projects. An example here would be the belief that modus ponens is valid. So basically, to do any reasoning, more or less, you need to be able to rely on modus ponens. And it, famously is the case that if you try to justify your logical principles, you just need to do more logic to do that. So you end up in this regress. Okay, so that's the kind of thing he's talking about here. And then, so what he says is, if you have a presupposition of a project, and you have a right to undertake that project, and trying to justify that presupposition would lead to an infinite regress, then you're entitled to trust in P, even without any positive reason to believe it. Okay, and then he says, unless sufficient evidence emerges against P to justify doubting it. So this is a kind of entitlement to trust in a proposition without having any reason whatsoever, positive reason epistemically to believe that it's true. And the point is that whether these conditions are met, the conditions on which we're entitled to trust in P, that's not supposed to depend on whether we're in contact with the objects that P is about. So certain of our arithmetical beliefs, according to Wright, are presuppositions of cognitive projects we have a right to undertake, maybe just projects that involve arithmetical reasoning. And he also suggests that trying to justify those beliefs would involve us in an infinite regress, basically because he wants to suggest that, say, Hume's principle is what is relevant here, but that doesn't really matter. He wants to suggest that its epistemology is similar to the epistemology of our logical laws. So he thinks that we have at least an initial entitlement to believe that Hume's principle is true. And that gets you all of the axioms of arithmetic. And that's supposed to happen, that has nothing to do with whether we're in contact, cognitive contact with mathematical objects. Right? It's just because there are these cognitive projects that we have a right to undertake, and Hume's principle for something in the neighborhood is a presupposition of those projects. Okay, so that's another way that you might try to get an easy knowledge theory going. And then the third one is Paul Boghossian's notion of epistemic analyticity, which has become very popular and is appealed to kind of routinely at this point by people who need a notion of analyticity for their project, but don't want to be saddled with some kind of conventionalism. So Chalmers, in his book Constructing the World, says all I need is epistemic analyticity. Same with Thomason in her Ontology Made Easy. And so what is epistemic analyticity? Well, an epistemically analytic sentence is basically a sentence such that grasp of its meaning suffices for justified belief in its content, at least prima facie. And to turn that notion into an easy knowledge theory, we just need to insist that a sentence can be epistemically analytic without being metaphysically analytic, where that means true purely in virtue of meaning, or that's something conventional. So in particular, we insist that even given sort of Platonism, where the abstract mathematical objects, for instance, are mind-independent and causally inert, sentences about those objects can be epistemically analytic. It can be the case that just by understanding our sentences, we're justified in believing those things. And of course, as long as your grasp of a sentence's meaning doesn't require cognitive contact with the objects the sentence is about, which people who appeal to epistemic analyticity tend to say it doesn't because they have some kind of inferential role semantics in mind, then your theory, again, turns out to be one on which your beliefs about abstract objects can be at least initially in good standing, despite our lack of contact with those objects. So basically, I'm just trying to give you a sense of like various different projects about the epistemology of arithmetic and things like that that have the flavor of this kind of easy knowledge, the structure of this kind of easy knowledge approach. Right? There's many different ones. Okay, so what does that have to do with the rest of the talk? Well, look, there's a lot more details that you could go into about any of these approaches, right? This Boghossian notion of epistemic analyticity, it's been claimed that really it kind of reduces to an entitlement of cognitive project in the end if you sort of give up any plausible account of how it could work. None of that's going to be relevant to my argument today. The details here are less important than the commonalities between the theories. And the main commonalities are, one, that these are just theories that are supposed to allow for easy knowledge in the sense that I'm talking about. And the other one that I need to emphasize here is that on any reasonable version of any of these views, whatever positive status you get for your beliefs is going to be defeasible. And that you saw explicitly that Wright said, unless you have sufficient justification to doubt NP, right? So Wright explicitly endorses sort of a defeasibility condition. Boghossian does as well when he describes his epistemic analyticity picture. And so do lots of reliabilists. So it's kind of a common thing in the reliabilist literature to try to say, oh, we need a notion, we need to make sense of defeasibility from within a reliabilist picture. And so there's just many, many attempts over the years to try to make that work. But the point is, it's like basically agreed by everyone reasonable, I'll say, that you need to have defeasibility if your reliabilism is gonna be sensible. Okay, so where we're headed is that we're going to grant, for the sake of argument, that one of the easy knowledge theories that I just described can be used to establish that our beliefs about abstract objects enjoy some kind of prima facie positive epistemic status, despite our lack of contact with those objects. We're just going to grant that for the sake of argument. And then my claim is that not only are these beliefs defeasible, but inevitably all of these beliefs, their positive status will be defeated. And in particular, I'm going to argue that the positive status is going to be undermined by a version of or sort of a development of the Benacerraf-Field challenge. And I'll explain what that is in a moment. But to make the argument is going to require presenting and defending my preferred version of the Benacerraf-Field challenge. And there have been many kind of ways of thinking about the challenge and objections to those ways. So it's a little bit of back and forth that we're going to have to go through. But that's going to be the project of the rest of the talk. Present my preferred version of the Benacerraf-Field challenge and defend it. Okay. So what is the Benacerraf-Field challenge? Well, as I'm going to describe it, it's an argument that's designed to show that Platonistic theories of abstract objects are untenable on the grounds that those theories make it impossible to explain our reliability about what the relevant objects are like. Okay. So the idea is this: given Platonism, it doesn't seem like there can be any connection between our beliefs being what they are and the objects being the way they are that could help us to explain why our beliefs about those objects are, for the most part, correct. So there's this coincidence between the facts of the matter and what we believe, and there's no mechanism by which we can explain that coincidence. And the thought is that recognizing this fact should lead us, if we're Platonists, of course, to doubt that those beliefs really are, for the most part, correct, or to give up Platonism. So this is an argument was originally conceived as a challenge to mathematical Platonism. Sort of its canonical statement is in Field's 1989 book. It's based on some considerations from a paper from 1973 by Paul Benacerraf, but like I said, the canonical statement, the improved version, comes from Field. But so anyway, so it was originally conceived as a challenge to mathematical Platonism in particular, but it generalizes, of course, to Platonistic theories of other kinds of abstracta as well. There's nothing specific about mathematical objects in the argument, and it perhaps generalizes even further. Some people think that there are analogous challenges for logic or for sort of moral realism, but I'm not going to discuss that here, sticking to abstract objects. Okay, so Field puts the argument in terms of whether it seems possible, at least in principle, to explain the correspondence between our mathematical beliefs and the mathematical facts, as I said. And if it doesn't seem impossible, at least in principle, to do that, then thought goes, our beliefs are thereby undermined. Why is that? Because the inexplicability, even in principle, of the correspondence between these two things would indicate that insofar as the correspondence does in fact obtain, that's just a lucky coincidence, right? Or in other words, the inexplicability of this, in principle inexplicability, would indicate that our mathematical beliefs are accidentally true, if they're true at all, right? In the same way that if I just, come to believe that Shirley won the lottery, and on the basis of a wild guess where I have no reason to think I have any kind of access to facts about lottery winners or something. Once I realize that fact, once I come to believe that my belief forming method is basically wildly guessing, it would be kind of absurd for me to continue believing that Shirley won the lottery. That's the defeat condition. So that seems to me to be what's really doing the work of undermining our beliefs. The thought is that it would be perverse, maybe even incoherent in some sense, to continue believing that 5 is a prime number, while also acknowledging that insofar as that belief is true, that it's true is purely an accident. So that's the basic thought behind the challenges I'm going to read it. If that's right, that means sort of we can forget about explanation, which is sort of a vexed topic anyway, and just put the Benacerraf-Field challenge directly in terms of a claim about epistemic luck or accidental truth. So a claim about the epistemological significance of learning or coming to believe that your belief is luckily true if it's true at all. So, okay, given all that background, it's pretty simple to state the argument schematically. According to Platonism about some domain D, our D beliefs are accidentally true if true at all. That's premise 1. We're going to evaluate the premises in a moment. According to premise 2, we can't rationally hold on both to our beliefs in a domain and to a theory according to which our beliefs in that domain are accidentally true if true at all. Therefore, rationality requires that we either give up our D beliefs or reject Platonism. Okay. So 3 things I want to mention about this argument before we move on. It's clearly a valid argument, right? If 1 and 2 are true, then 3 is definitely true. And it's also an argument that doesn't require us to give to start from a place of some kind of Cartesian doubt, right? It's not sort of a general skeptical argument. It's an argument that allows us, when we're trying to decide whether we think it's an accident that our D beliefs are true, to appeal to our own theory of the world, where that includes our D beliefs. So, if we're talking about mathematics, we're allowed to appeal to facts about mathematics in our explanations. We're allowed to take for granted that they are in fact true, and then decide, given our own theory of the world, is it just an accident that they're true? So this is going to limit its scope so that it doesn't blow up into kind of a generalized skepticism. And the third thing is, it doesn't require a particular epistemological theory. All that is required is a kind of coherence constraint given by 2 that I argue is a commitment of any reasonable epistemological view, right? You can't reasonably believe P while also believing if my belief that P is true, it's true purely as a lucky, it's purely a lucky coincidence that it's true. That's the point. Okay, so the question that we have to answer in order to decide what the implications are is whether it's a sound argument, whether the premises are true. So can we understand the notion of accidental truth in here in such a way that both of our premises turn out to be plausibly true? That's the question. So here I want to start with a traditional way of thinking about the Benacerraf-Field challenge in terms of sort of a modal notion. So, all right, so again, the source of the problem here is supposed to be that there's no connection between our D beliefs being what they are and the relevant objects having the features they do, according to Platonism, right? Because Platonism is a view on which our abstract objects are mind independent and causally inert, in a completely separate realm. That's by stipulation. That's what Platonism is here. So that means our beliefs fail to be responsive in any way to what the facts are. And that's what's behind the judgment that the beliefs are accidentally true, if they're true, supposedly. Okay, so that's the idea. And if you think about things in those terms, you'll notice that there is a modal property that's well known from the literature in modal epistemology, going back to Robert Nozick, that is intended to serve as a kind of proxy for this responsiveness that's relevant here, right? And that's the notion of sensitivity. So what is sensitivity? Well, for an agent's belief that P to be sensitive is just for the following counterfactual to be true. If it weren't the case that P, the agent wouldn't believe it. And the idea is that a sensitive belief is responsive to the facts in the following sense. Well, if we made changes to the part of the world relevant to whether P, that would result in a change to the agent's belief. And in that sense, we get responsiveness. Because in the world where P turns out to not to be true, the agent believes something different than they believe in the actual world. That's the sense in which we have responsiveness. Okay, so this explains why Field himself sometimes suggests that the challenge is to be understood in terms of sensitivity counterfactuals. Here is an example. In a 2005 paper, he says, the Benacerraf problem in mathematics, he's talking about logic as well here, but that doesn't matter because in the end, he doesn't think that there's a challenge for logic, so remove those bits. Anyway, the Benacerraf problem in mathematics seems to arise from the thought that we would have had exactly the same mathematical beliefs, even if the mathematical facts were different, right? That's the insensitivity. Because of this, it can only be a coincidence if our mathematical beliefs are right, and this undermines those beliefs. Okay, so that's his own description of how the challenge is supposed to work. I will note that this way of understanding the challenge has not been particularly popular and is thought to be subject to some very easy counterexamples. Okay, so sometimes it's alleged that even according to Platonism, our beliefs about abstract objects do turn out to be sensitive for reasons I'll explain in a moment. And if that's right, then of course premise one, which would, if we understand it as according to Platonism about D, our D beliefs fail to be sensitive, that just turns out to be false, obviously. And it's also thought that there are beliefs that obviously fail to be sensitive, but that obviously are not thereby undermined. And if there are such beliefs, there are counterexamples to premise two. If we understand it as we can't rationally hold on both to our beliefs in some domain and to a theory according to which our beliefs in that domain fail to be sensitive. Right, so it's thought that on the sensitivity picture, both premises are false, so there is no problem here, or there may be a problem here, but the field has not correctly identified it. So in short, if as I said, if we replace our accidentally true if true at all with fail to be sensitive in the schematic argument I gave, then purportedly the resulting premises are both false, which is a problem for the other. So what I want to do now is try to explain why it is that we can still develop kind of a sensitivity-based version of the challenge, even in the face of those problems. So the idea is that these problems are actually just artifacts of the fact that sensitivity turns out to be an imperfect proxy for responsiveness, the kind of responsiveness that I claimed was relevant to whether we should take the truth of our beliefs to be a lucky coincidence. So what I think is going on is that sensitivity was supposed to stand in for this kind of responsiveness, but it just turns out it doesn't do a very good job, and so we have to develop something that does a better job. So the kinds of cases in which the problems arise, it turns out, are precisely cases in which sensitivity and our intuitive notion of responsiveness come apart. By attending to that fact, we can just generate a new proxy that's sensitivity-based, but that doesn't come apart from responsiveness in the cases in question. I'm not convinced that we need to do this, by the way. Maybe we can just use responsiveness itself, and that would be fine. But I'm going to go along with the idea that we need a modal proxy for the moment and try to explain how we can have them, even in the face of the worries that I'm about to talk. And using the new proxy is going to give us a reading of our argument on which the worries that I've mentioned, and that I'll develop further in a minute, just don't arise. So both premises turn out to be true, at least plausibly. So that's what I'm going to do. Try to explain how to revise our sensitivity-based account here to make it the case that both of the premises of our challenge are true. Okay, so here's an example of a belief that is obviously not undermined, despite it being obvious that it fails to be sensitive. This comes from a Roger White paper called "You Just Believe That Because ... about sort of genealogical objections to beliefs. There are many other examples. I'll talk about them in a second. But here's White's example. So suppose we're jury members in a case where there's a lot of compelling evidence about who did the crime, DNA, fingerprints, eyewitnesses, whatever. As much evidence as you can imagine. So we believe, I'm going to stipulate with justification that the defendant is guilty. And then the claim is we can also believe with justification that there wasn't an elaborate conspiracy in which all the evidence we've seen was planted despite the defendant's innocence. Why can we believe that with justification? Because it obviously follows from the guilt of the defendant. Right? It's just closure under very, very obvious entailment. But notice that this second belief is not sensitive. Right? If there were a conspiracy, the hypothesis is constructed so that we would have exactly the same evidence that we have now. And so we would believe exactly the same thing that we believe now. So we have a belief that, if all this is right, a belief that definitely is insensitive, sort of by construction, but also we're justified in having that belief. Okay, so it seems to be that what's going on here, roughly, is that we have an insensitive belief whose truth is guaranteed by the truth of a belief that is sensitive, namely our belief that the defendant is guilty. There's lots of cases with this structure in the modal epistemology literature. One that people like to talk about is my belief that I don't falsely believe that I have hands. All right, my belief that I have hands presumably is sensitive because the nearest world where I don't are worlds where I've had some horrible accident or something. Talk about that. But my belief that I don't falsely believe that I have hands by construction is insensitive because in the nearest worlds where that belief is false, I falsely believe that I have hands, which means I believe that I have hands. So, which means, yeah, anyway, you get it. Okay, so my question is, so these kinds of cases are often brought up as objections to sensitivity-based accounts. And my question is why? Let's think about why insensitivity does not have a tendency to undermine in cases with this particular structure. And it seems to me that the answer is pretty simple. This is something I've discussed in an earlier paper on sensitivity in particular. Just despite the insensitivity of the beliefs, the belief that there wasn't the elaborate conspiracy, for instance, it's just not the case that that belief is merely accidentally true. Right? It's not a lucky coincidence that that belief is true. The guilt of the defendant causes us to believe that the defendant is guilty. That belief is responsive to the features of the world relevant to its truth, right? But the guilt of the defendant also suffices to guarantee that there wasn't this kind of elaborate conspiracy. So part of the and finally, part of the explanation of why we believe that there wasn't the elaborate conspiracy is that we believe that there is this sufficiency. So our grounds for believing that the defendant is guilty are, by our own lights, guaranteed to be sufficient also to ground the belief that there wasn't this elaborate conspiracy. So what that tells us is just that there's a feature of the world, namely the defendant's being guilty, such that it suffices for the truth of the proposition that there wasn't this elaborate conspiracy, and is such that our being responsive to it is part of what explains why we believe that there wasn't this elaborate conspiracy. So it's clear enough that this belief, despite its insensitivity, my claim is it's responsive to the facts in the way it needs to be for its truth to be non-accidental. So there is a connection of the right sort between our having the belief and the relevant part of the world being the way it is, despite the insensitivity. The way I've described this in the previous paper I just mentioned is that the belief kind of inherits its responsiveness to facts from our belief that the defendant is guilty. So we have a belief that the defendant is guilty, that's responsive to the facts, and this is this belief that there wasn't the elaborate conspiracy is responsive to the facts also, but in this kind of inherent. If that's the correct diagnosis, then the problem here is simply that this is a case where sensitivity and responsiveness come apart, and cases with this structure show that the relationship between sensitivity and responsiveness, or sensitivity and non-accidental truth, is just not as straightforward as we might think. So how do we fix this? So how can we build a new modal proxy that returns the right verdicts in cases of this sort of inherited responsiveness? And I think the answer is fairly simple. Something that, as far as I know, is first proposed by Sherilyn Rausch in a book called Tracking Truth. Although she motivates it in a different way than I do. But let's just build a new modal constraint here. So let's call an agent's belief that P are sensitive, recursively sensitive, when it meets one of the following conditions. Either the agent wouldn't believe that P, or not the case that P, so either the belief is sensitive, or for some Q, the truth of which is sufficient for the truth of P, the agent believes that Q, the truth of that belief independently counts as recursively sensitive, and the agent takes her grounds for believing that Q to suffice also to ground her belief that P. Right? And by construction, the set of our sensitive beliefs includes precisely the following: beliefs that are sensitive and insensitive beliefs that exhibit the sort of inherited responsiveness that I just displayed in the case of the jury. So what's the point? Point is, our sensitivity is just a better modal proxy for responsiveness than sensitivity is. Specifically, the kind of responsiveness that's relevant to whether we should take truths of our beliefs to be a lucky coincidence. So this R sensitivity proxy gives us the right verdicts in cases where sensitivity gives us the wrong ones, cases with a structure of White's jury case. So if we return to premise 2 of our argument, again, cases like White's are counterexamples to that premise. If we understand it as follows, we can't rationally hold on both to our beliefs in a domain and to a theory according to which our beliefs in that domain fail to be sensitive. But if we just replace sensitivity with our sensitivity as formulation, then there's no longer counterexamples with the relevant structure. I've argued elsewhere that all of the counterexamples to this sensitivity condition have this structure. But in any case, the kinds of counterexamples that are most often brought up are ones with the structure of White's case. So the premise plausibly is true. Okay, so that I think deals with this first worry, this worry about insensitive but still non-accidentally true beliefs. What about the second worry? Remember, that was the worry that our beliefs about abstract objects turn out to be sensitive anyway, in which case the other premise is false. So here's what's supposed to be going on there. Propositions about abstract objects, generally speaking, are necessary. There aren't any possible worlds where those propositions fail to be true. And on the usual semantics, a counterfactual is true if its consequent is true in the nearest worlds where the antecedent is true. But there's also this other case where there just aren't any worlds where the antecedent is true. And on the usual semantics, in those worlds, the counterfactual is just vacuously true. So that's if the antecedent is the negation of a necessary truth, then it's just automatically true, the counterfactual on the standard semantics, the Lewis-Stonelacker semantics. So if there are no worlds where it's not the case that P, if it's impossible for P to be false, and if we believe that P, then vacuously, we wouldn't believe that P if it weren't the case that P. Okay, that's just how it's supposed to work. And if that's right, then our beliefs about abstract objects, insofar as they're true, which remember we're allowing ourselves to assume that they are, they just turn out to be sensitive trivially, and also sensitive, are sensitive trivially. So this depends on a very specific way of understanding how to deal with counterpossibles, counterfactuals with necessarily false antecedents. And maybe you just wouldn't want to deny that. So sometimes you could suggest instead that the relevant sensitivity counterfactuals aren't vacuously true, but they're just like not evaluable. They're like, there's something wrong with them. But even so, we have a problem for a sensitivity-based understanding of the Benacerraf-Field challenge, because if you can't evaluate them for sensitivity, then you can't get the rest of the challenge going. Okay. So what is my diagnosis of this problem? Well, I think it's really obvious that the sort of trivial sensitivity that you get when you have beliefs with necessarily true contents just has nothing to do with responsiveness whatsoever. That's fairly clear. To put it impressionistically, if we can't make any changes to the part of the world relevant to whether P, we just cannot test whether changing that part of the world would result in changes to the agent's belief. The test fails in that case. Okay. So what we need to do, if we want to still use some version of a sensitivity condition, is to adjust our counterfactual semantics to include metaphysically possible worlds. That is if we want to maintain sort of some kind of sensitivity-based interpretation of the Benacerraf-Field challenge, there just isn't another option. So that so that's going to allow us to consider worlds where the mathematical facts are different, for instance, so that we can test whether our mathematical beliefs would be different in those worlds. So we can test whether our mathematical beliefs are responsive to the relevant facts. Of course, the obvious thing to wonder is whether that's a legitimate move. Why should we include metaphysically impossible worlds in our semantics in this context? Right. That's the obvious question to ask here. And the answer, I think, is that there is a case to be made here. And here's the case that I want to try to make. Okay, so in the context of the Benacerraf-Field challenge, if I'm the agent, I'm considering from a first personal perspective whether the truth of my own belief that P, 5 is a prime number, is a lucky coincidence, whether it's a lucky coincidence that my own belief is true. In order to do that, what I have to consider is whether it's just an accident that from all the candidates for being my actual situation, the things that from my perspective are candidates for being my actual situation, I have picked out the one that I'm actually in. Right? That's what it is to worry about whether my own belief is merely accidentally true. Like, is it just an accident that I've picked out from all the candidates the situation that I am in fact in? And so in that case, I'm considering a candidate situation where it is not the case that P, and thinking about whether in that situation, the world would seem to me the same way that it seems now. That's more or less what I'm doing. But the point is that a candidate for being my actual situation is a world that is epistemically possible from my perspective in the following sense. It's a world that I haven't definitively ruled out from the start that it'll turn out to be the actual world. Okay. This is Jamie Collin has some work on this. I've talked about this in another paper. So that's the idea. We need, and so arguably the worlds that are relevant to undermining in this context are the worlds that are epistemically possible for the agent in question. Those are the worlds that are we should use in our counterfactual semantics, at least in this context. I'm not saying that all counterfactuals should be evaluated epistemically. So here's the crucial observation. A world can be epistemically possible in the relevant sense from an agent's perspective, even if it's a metaphysically impossible world, in fact, or according to the agent's theory, right? So in particular, right, so this is the second place where defeasibility comes in, because you need to establish defeasibility for me to, I need to have, establish the claim that these beliefs are defeasible in order to argue that they're defeated. But here's another place where defeasibility comes in. What it is for our beliefs to be defeasible is for us not to have definitively ruled out all the worlds in which those beliefs are false, right? So for there to still be candidate situations that are worlds where those beliefs are false. And so if P is the content of, the mathematical belief that's under consideration, right? That is the proposition that 5 is a prime number. There are going to be epistemically possible worlds where it's not the case that P. Okay? Because, given the structure of everything, if you're a Platonist with an easy knowledge theory, all you have is defeasible good standing for your mathematical beliefs. So there, from your perspective, there are going to be candidate situations, epistemically possible worlds where your belief is false. So if it's right that these are the kinds of worlds we should use in the counterfactual semantics in this context, then the relevant sensitivity conditional just isn't vacuously true. And in fact, it's pretty clear that if we're Platonists, we're going to judge it to be false, right? Because if we're Platonists, we're going to say that the objects are mind independent and causally inert. And that means that sort of the mathematical realm is separate completely from the physical realm. So changes in the mathematical realm would not result in sort of other unrelated changes in the physical realm. So we can, the changes in what the mathematical objects are like or whether they exist at all, presumably the nearest worlds where the mathematical realm is different in those ways would be worlds where the physical realm is the same. So we have the same beliefs irrespective of what the objects were like, if that's the case. So there are technical details to be worked out about how to understand similarity and in the semantics that includes impossible worlds. I'm going to claim that everything that needs to be worked out for my purposes can be worked out here. But that's the basic idea. So we not only are these sensitivity conditionals understood epistemically not vacuously true, they are false from a Platonist perspective. Okay, so let's put the pieces together. So we're going to call an agent's belief first personally sensitive if it's sensitive given this epistemic reading, right, where the sensitivity counterfactual is given the sort of agent relative epistemic reading we're talking about. And we're going to call a belief first personally R sensitive when the belief is R sensitive, where the sensitivity conditional in the base clause is given this epistemic reading. So it's evident here, I think, that first personal R sensitivity is a much better modal proxy for responsiveness than sensitivity is. So let's just look to see what happens when we replace R accidentally true if true at all with fail to be first personally R sensitive in both of the premises of the Benacerraf-Field challenge. Notice here that we don't need to have given like an analysis of what it is for a belief to be accidentally true at all for my claims here to go through. What we need is just for the premises to both turn out to be true. It doesn't matter if they're sort of equivalent in meaning to are accidentally true, if true at all. Okay, so here's what the new argument looks like. According to Platonism about D, our D beliefs are not first personally R sensitive. That premise is true. As we've noted, the beliefs fail to be first personally sensitive. And again, we're totally cut off from abstract objects according to this Platonist view. So there aren't going to be other R sensitivity beliefs, R sensitive beliefs from which those beliefs can inherit their responsiveness. Right? Again, the two realms are just completely disconnected by hypothesis. And then premise 2 is we can't rationally hold on both to our beliefs in some domain and to a theory according to which those beliefs fail to be first personally R sensitive. And again, this premise is plausibly true too. But as I mentioned, when you go recursive, you just eliminate the kind of counterexamples that you get from Roger White and people like that. Therefore, rationality requires that we either give up our D beliefs or reject Platonism above. So we still have a valid argument, and plausibly both premises are true. That's the claim. So it appears, if that's right, that any initial positive epistemic status that we get for our D beliefs is, if we're Platonists, inevitably going to be defeated. That's the idea. And Platonists who have gone in for some kind of easy knowledge strategy. Okay, so what have we done? Okay, I introduced Platonism and this like easy knowledge approach to trying to dissolve our epistemological puzzle for Platonism. Noted that on easy knowledge approaches, our beliefs are defeasible, and then developed a version of the Benacerraf-Field challenge on which, if insofar as those beliefs are defeasible, it turns out that they are defeated. If my adjustments have done the work that I wanted to do for our premises. Okay, so let's close out. So what I want to emphasize to end is that the epistemological premise, remember premise 2, plausibly is a commitment of any reasonable epistemological theory. Why? Because it's just a modal proxy for the claim that we can't reasonably believe something while acknowledging that insofar as the belief is true, it's merely accidentally true. Its truth is just a lucky coincidence. Okay. And this just amounts to the claim that the information that a belief is accidentally true at all is a defeater. And it's just very hard to deny this claim, no matter what route to easy knowledge we try to posit. Again, if we think about these kinds of cases where I just find myself believing that a particular person won the lottery, once I become convinced that the reason I believe that has no connection to the fact of the matter about who won the lottery, I should believe that insofar as the belief is true, this is just a lucky coincidence, and it would just be perverse of me to continue believing that the particular person won the lottery in that kind of case. So it's just very hard. It seems very hard to me to deny that kind of claim. So what does that suggest? Well, it suggests that if we're hoping to provide a naturalist-friendly picture on which knowledge of abstract objects is not mysterious, finessing our epistemological theory is just not going to be enough. Instead, we need a theory on which abstract objects are not both mind-independent and causally independent. So we need to give up that form of platonism. Thanks.
Hey, thank you for that very interesting talk. So I'm going to follow our usual practice of following on graduate student or faculty trying to alternate. I have some sense of who has their hands up, but I'm going to ask you to just raise your hands every time rather than trying to write down.
Oh.
Doug.
Okay, thanks for the talk. So I'd like to try to get a little bit of a better grip on this question now is asking what counts as an easy knowledge of abstract. Because this is like the opportunity for me to just shoot my mouth off with my sort of a very exceedingly rough and ready version of an easy account of knowledge of abstract, and then see whether you think it would fall prey to this kind of work. And I think no great claims to originality, far from it. First of all, it's very crude anyway. But I do think that, like a very high bird's eye level of remove, it's very roughly similar to what Justin Clark done and some others might prefer. Here's the very rough, possibly crazy sounding picture I have. So we come to knowledge of abstract objects like just focus on numbers by noticing patterns in the world. Whoever we is, the initial baptizers of numbers, or whatever, let's ignore that for the moment. Notice that certain relations among groups of objects in the world hold and do not hold. And they come up with various names for them, and then something like the following happens. Here's maybe somewhat wild hypothesis. What they do is they say, here's what I mean by the number 3. I mean that abstract object, which is such that this grouping instantiates a pattern that is structurally analogous to that thing. That's what I mean by the number 3. And so on for various other numbers. And you can imagine that. You could tell a roughly similar sounding story for how it has become to have knowledge of what the addition operation is and the multiplication operation. Sure. And again, very rough and ready thought is that, okay, that together with some basic logic might be able to get you a lot of mathematics. And so my thought then is that, okay, so here's the story. We come to have knowledge of arithmetical truths by our contact with these patterns instantiated in the world. And we have knowledge of those abstract objects just in case there is the appropriate resemblance relation between the structure of those abstract objects and the patterns that we see instantiated by the groupings of objects in the world. It's a really, to the extent that's plausible at all, then it's a tall order to say that can be extended to other abstract objects. And right away, of course, I can imagine that there's a couple of natural objections, right? Arguably, you could say if you conceive of numbers along this way, then maybe it would collapse our knowledge of the number 5 and the set composed of such and such elements, right? Arguably, it wouldn't leave enough of a gap between those two, perhaps. And maybe you could say that no, it's still not obvious why this would count as knowledge of the abstracta. Maybe you could push back and say, no, it's still just knowledge of some patterns in the world, but there's still not enough of a connection between our purported knowledge and the abstracta themselves. Nevertheless, I'd like to hear what you think. Do you think this sort of, admittedly very crude view, would still be vulnerable to what you're saying?
Thanks. The short answer is yes, I do think that view is to be vulnerable, and the reason is that here's a simple reason. So there's an existential claim that number 5 exists. Okay, so you have a referring term, that abstract objects which instantiates this structure. The structure of this pattern. The patterns don't require the existence of abstract objects for the patterns in nature. So the question is why? Yeah. So what is going to be vulnerable to this kind of challenge is the additional existential claim that there is this abstract object that our belief is about. That our belief is a belief about. So if we were going to, not go in for that or not take that language seriously, then it seems to me we would just be some kind of nominalist, and then you wouldn't be vulnerable to this kind of objection. But if you think, and also the number 5 exists, or there are numbers, then that's where the epistemological question sort of arises most sharply, I think.
I think I'm getting the feel. Thank you.
Okay, Sharon?
Is there someone else perhaps you can
Well, Andrew is an interesting status.
Oh,
Andrew is
shit,
student.
I have my glasses on.
I'm in
I don't
departmental
need to-
limbo, actually. Yeah.
Okay, so, like, would you say that the same consideration rules out there being a pen and a pen, that's maybe pen and a pen cap, or a restaurant over and above the bricks and mortar?
I think
This is not, this is like just inviting you to say more about like that, that follow.
yes. The short answer is yes. If you take that to be sort of a metaphysically substantive claim about composite objects, then there is going to be the same kind of question that arises. And I think so. Daniel Corman has written a book called "Potting Objects: Nothing Out of the Ordinary," where he sort of develops this challenge and tries to answer it. But I think that. And he takes the challenge seriously, which is admirable. But I think you are in the end vulnerable to the same kind of challenge, and I think.
Thomason?
What's that?
Did you list Thomason?
Oh, I did list Thomas. Yeah.
And wouldn't she? And her idea is like, they're easy objects. So
Yeah.
she would be like, and we need to accept that, metaphysically robust, like further.
Right. Well, so this is what's it's hard for me to understand Thomason's view in detail, because she does say in Ontology Made Easy, which is the one I mentioned, that all she needs is an epistemic notion of analyticity. And by the time she gets to the next book, Forms of Necessity, she seems to that claim doesn't appear anywhere in the next book. And it seems to me that she is a sort of robustly inferentialist figure, and she thinks fundamentally these necessary truths are like, she's like a kind of something like an expressivist account of what those are. And so I think if she says we don't need metaphysical analyticity, we only need epistemic analyticity, then she is vulnerable to the same problem. But once she sort of sets that claim aside and becomes sort of and sort of clarifies the sort of more robustly deflationary picture, I think she might be okay. I don't know how clear that was. Or...
I was going to say, sorry for like the swerve to like undo the like swerve into inside baseball for a second. along with, a little more. So the where he was like, oh, why is it that the Platonist is like committed to this idea that it's mathematical facts would have been different? You would have still believed the same. You would have believed accordingly differently. You think, oh, there's a connection between mathematical facts and logical facts that constrain ordinary objects, that constrain physical objects. So the mathematical facts have been different, than the other logical facts and physical facts, etc. would be different. Some kind of relationship along those lines, and suggest that we could have like counterfactuals like work out. And then I take that question of broad thoughts, including the question that you're asking. And now I take it Brad is saying, well, this counterfactual where mathematical facts are different. I want to consider that like the easiest way for mathematical facts to be different might be that the logical facts and the physical facts are all the same, and it's just that there isn't a number 3 that's hanging out there as a mascot of the pattern of 3 things. So just the last stage of Kevin, that's different. And then the worry is like, all right, so if you want to require, if we require this safety condition, if we require if the facts have been different, we would believe differently. And if we catch out counterfactuals where math is different, as like being involving things going wrong at the very last stage, so all the logical and like physical stuff is the same, but they're just just platonic heaven fails to relate in a way that's as expected. Then it seems like we can have a similar challenge to like lots of other cases where we think that by perceiving things about bricks, where our house is, or by perceiving things about a pen and a cat, we know what the pen is, or perceiving things about people, we know where the country is, or just any kind of thing where we have some sort of high level object supervening on like low level objects. If you're like, we require that if those facts would be different, then we would believe differently. And you count and you understand that counterfactual as being, if bricks and mortar range like this hadn't sufficed for the existence of a restaurant, then then it looks like we should worry about the existence of restaurants. So that's like where we were right before Fred answered his last answer to my question. And he's like, yeah, I think that so I think that you're accepting that, or you're saying at least that is like, so we should have that kind of skepticism, at least if we're going to be like metaphysically serious about these like restaurants, as extra things, nations as extra things, mathematical objects as extra things. And so I think that's super clarificatory and awesome. And then I was just quibbling about, does like Thompson count as like metaphysically serious about these things as extra things in that way, which is the discount is in the like, finding what there is, like there are in fact sets of numbers, I don't accept, whatever further metaphysical seriousness is required to make that the right way of evaluating that. Yeah, so thank you. That was an awesome answer. I just wanted to, like bring along, let other people appreciate what you're saying.
Thank you. And thanks. And to add a little bit to that, there is, so if you don't say the thing I said about, taking the metaphysics of composition seriously, then it turns out that we have like here's my trivial answer to why mereological nihilists are just misguided. There are pens, and I think that's not a serious answer to mereological nihilism. So insofar as that's not a serious answer to mereological nihilism, then we're going to have the same kinds of problems in those kinds of cases too.
Andrew. Okay, so do you want to go into slide 35? Okay. Yeah. So this is we're thinking first personally, right?
Yes.
Starting out as, let's assume we start out as easy knowledge Platonists. We haven't censored beliefs about abstract objects are defeasible. We haven't definitively ruled out worlds in which those beliefs are false. So I think I'm an easy knowledge Platonist. I feel like I've definitively ruled out the 2 + 2 = 5. What do you mean by definitively ruled out here? Because I kind of I feel like I've got great reason to think starting out that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 5, and it's false that 2 plus 2 equals 4. So yeah, I guess I'm trying to figure out your notion of epistemic possibility here, or where have I gone wrong?
Okay, yeah, so the point is gonna be, I guess I'll say, so does your belief commit you to the existence of numbers?
Yeah, well, okay, I'm right, so first person, so, okay, so community is numbers. Well, I think that, existential introduction is all a little different. So 2 plus 2, it's not the case that 2 plus 2 equals 5, therefore it's not the case that there's a number such that when you add it,
Okay.
such that it equals 2, when you add it to itself, it equals 5. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. So, maybe negations, maybe negations are okay if they're not existentially committing, because of the reference conditions on our numbers or something like that. So, yeah.
Well, there is a number such as, and here's something that's false about it, right?
Okay.
When you add it to itself.
Okay. Well, in that case, then I guess, it depends on the question. The answer to the question of like what you would believe if there weren't any numbers. If you believe that there are numbers, so what would you believe if there aren't any numbers?
Yeah.
But why?
Well, okay. So maybe I could just abstract out here a bit. So just a more broad issue here. I think, yeah, there's the feasible and there's the feasible, right? So I could think if I had this philosophical theory that I would have to obviously say maybe at some level my commitments are defeasible, right? But on the other hand, it seems like you wanted to say, it seems like I'm worried that you're carrying in this notion of defeasibility is, I think, maybe doing a little too much work, I guess, because I mean, you could say just generally speaking, our commitments are feasible, right? But on the other hand, I don't know why it means that we can't say like we know certain things starting out, like we know that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 5 and all those sorts of things. So I'm just trying, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is what work you think the notion of feasibility is doing here for the easy knowledge there. So that's another way of framing my question.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, when I say definitively, I mean like with certainty. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
So, even if you are extremely confident that 2 plus 2 equals 4 or whatever it is, then just sort of by the way that I define my terms. If you are a Platonist and an easy knowledge theorist, you're not gonna be certain that you're correct if you're reflective.
Okay.
And that's enough, I think, to get this going.
Okay. That helps me understand. Gary.
Yeah, good. This is a follow-up in a way, so I'd like to pursue this more. And so there's a lot of different possible meanings you could give to the feasibility from a first-person point of view. And you said, I'm not sure now, especially after your answer to Sharon, how to take this, but you said you don't need at any point any Cartesian skepticism. So I'm going to assume we're working from within, and we have the belief that 5 is a prime number, yet we're not dogmatic in some sense, so certain things are more certain than others for us, but we realize that, even very firmly held beliefs have had to be revised and so on. So we can say we accept the feasibility in that methodological sense. But now taking a page from Hilary Putnam, which I've worked on myself quite a bit, there is a question whether that means we can actually make sense of there being a world in which it isn't true right now. So what he would say and I would say is to say we're committed to the feasibility across the board is not to say for every statement we accept, we can make sense of it not being true now. It's to say something like, it could very well be that we're missing something, but we can't see what it is now, and maybe things will change. So the example I mentioned to you earlier today is Frege with his law 5, the most fastidious logician who ever lived, believed that law, expressed some doubts, not sure that it wouldn't be defeated, but had no understanding of how it could be defeated. He would be, I would say, he would classify it as feasible in some sense for all of his views, but that he didn't see any way it could be defeated. So from the first person point of view for that belief, there is no possible world in which it's not true. So it's not epistemically possible in your sense for him at that time. Yet still, in some broad sense, methodologically feasible. And I think that would be the way that a version of the easy knowledge theorists would best respond to your argument, that it just doesn't apply because you don't get from the feasible the possible world in which the belief is false.
I see. Well, I mean, maybe this is a very flat-footed response, but what I would want to say is that what I've described is sort of definitionally there are these kinds of possible worlds because what it is to acknowledge that your belief might turn out not to be true is to acknowledge that the world might be some other way than the way you take it to be. So to acknowledge that there are some possible, even if you maybe can't describe them well or can't understand what they would look like necessarily, there just are these ways that the world might turn out to be that are different from the ways that you take the world to be.
But that doesn't, so that may be true by definition, but that wouldn't be relevant to my first person assessment of risk on my understanding. My first person assessment of risk comes from my own understanding of what's really open as possibly false. And to be told that according to your definition, there's something open that's possibly false is not going to move me thinking, oh, gee, I'm at risk here. Unless it's connected with how I understand myself to be at risk.
Well, so the claim is that, okay, sorry if I'm not answering your question properly, but the claim is that if you are a Platonist and you are an easy knowledge theorist, so you've adopted one of these easy knowledge theories, you're recognizing that there is this kind of risk and adopting a theory on which that doesn't matter to the good standing of your belief.
Is that also by definition?
No, I don't think that's by definition.
No, right. So this is my last follow-up. If Platonism really just means that the objects in question are not part of the causal realm, that's it. It doesn't mean something further about it's being kind of impossible for you ever to have knowledge of them. That's not built into it.
No, it's not.
Then I don't see how the risk follows from Platonism at all. I mean, that begs a question against easy knowledge to say that. It does. You're supposed to be showing that easy knowledge has a built-in risk here with regard to Platonism, not assuming it. And what I'm trying to say is from the first person point of view, I don't see how you've shown that yet. Because it's unless you're assuming a Cartesian skepticism from within, I think one is not going to see any way which the beliefs could be false. So, definition of prime, definition of 5. Yeah, I don't get how that could not be true. That 5 is my number. Nobody gets it, frankly. So,
well, I mean, I take your point. I will say that if you look at, for instance, the Crispin Wright approach, he specifically says that there's a kind of adventurousness in adopting these presuppositions. So these kinds of views I would have thought are just views according to which there is this risk, and the way Crispin formulates the view has that
Mm.
has that implication. And maybe there are ways to formulate views on which there isn't any such implication. But that's what I was.
Yeah, let me end on a nice note. I agree with you that Crispin Wright is vulnerable.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Matthew has a follow-up to that question.
Yeah, just very briefly. So I guess I also shared some of Gary's concerns of, you don't want the argument just to sort of stipulate that this is how the possible worlds will work for it to come out true. But I guess I was wondering if there is something more you could say to Gary's type of concern, and tell me if I'm confused, maybe it could help me understand the position better. So running with this example of Frege, this brilliant magician, he doesn't have any, he can't, from within his particular epistemic vantage point, conceptualize how he could give up a particular commitment. He just, that's epistemically opaque to him. Is it enough for your account to say, well, okay, so that's epistemically opaque, any details about what would require him to relinquish that commitment? But it's not perhaps epistemically opaque from a first person perspective, the sort of possibility that this external criticism or objection could come across that he just doesn't have any ability to conceptualize at the moment, that would then put him in a position to rationate. I mean, is that much sort of epistemically transparent to him, and is that enough to dodge this interesting concern that's scary and for you to get your argument running? Because that seems if that's a type of diffusibility that would be different from skepticism.
Yeah.
Yeah, could still accommodate some of these concerns about that. Well, I was just wondering, maybe it doesn't work, but maybe it would help me understand.
I mean, I suspect that. I mean, that's my view. I suspect that that is the case. That kind of diffusibility is going to be enough. And and the reason just has to do with. I mean, how could it be the case that if 5 fails to be a prime number? Well, if I'm wrong about whether there are abstract objects, I guess I don't see how that is somehow inaccessible to us. So yeah, I don't know. Even if like sort of how the world would then be might be somehow opaque to us.
Could you go back to a slide that has the original formulation of the second premise? And while you're looking for that, so I'm going to postulate for what I think is a problem for that premise, and I'm wondering if it's also a problem for the revised version of it. Find it somewhere.
There we go.
Oh, great. Yeah. So we can't rationally hold on both to our beliefs in some domain and to a theory according to which our beliefs in that domain are accidentally true at all.
Yeah.
So I think it's actually really hard to know how we can rationally believe in, say, theories and epistemology, like what makes it rational for me to believe. But suppose there is a rational way.
Yeah.
Theory and sure. Yeah. Okay. Right. So I've got some rational belief that there's a table here. So the domain's like medium-sized physical object. Rational table there. And suppose that I've worked through epistemology and I've talked to really smart epistemologists, and through all of that, I've acquainted myself with some theory, and I've got good reasons for believing that theory is true. Rationally hold that theory. Okay. But suppose that unbeknownst to me and unbeknownst to any other philosophers, through some really labyrinthine, mess, it turns out that this theory is committed to saying that all of my perceptual beliefs are unjustified, but no one could possibly know that this is an implication. Like a great grandchild of Gettier is going to discover this later on. seems to me like a possible situation I could be in, where it's still rational for me to believe there's a table here, and I can rationally believe that theory, even though according to that theory, the beliefs in that domain are just accidentally true.
Okay, so there's like very clearly questions here about ideal versus non-ideal theory, in epistemology. And so I would say, like, you know, the rationally ideal agent who is logically omniscient, sort of thing, would be committed for sure to either giving up the theory or giving up the belief. So we are not those people. Arguably, there could not possibly be such people. But yeah, in that case, maybe a more careful formulation would say, I think maybe in the paper I am a little more careful this way, would say something, you know, we can't believe P and believe if my belief that P is true, then it's purely accidental. So one, you know, and maybe in that case it turns into like this talk, if it's successful, makes it the case that you can no longer be a Platonist rationally even if you could before. Anyway, so yeah, so that's so I think that the argument would still if you replaced that premise with a more this kind of more careful formulation.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to go back to the Benacerraf-Field challenge and the notion of the lucky coincidence. And what counts as a lucky coincidence or something accidental. Because my worry is that the notion is being overloaded. So if it were the case, and this is related to my puzzle about what it would be to think numbers exist, right? So so supposedly the worry for the Platonist is, even if it's true that 5 is prime, at best it will be my belief that 5 is prime, despite all my mathematical ability to prove that, will still be a lucky coincidence. And part of my worry is, if we can't even imagine what a story would be like to get that right, then it's not just that it's not a coincidence. The very distinction between coincidence or not, or accidental or non-accidental, doesn't apply. Put it another way. What if it turns out, that if my ways of establishing that 5 is prime are not reliable, or not things I can take for granted in the ordinary way, then I can't really count as having beliefs about the number 5 in the first place. In which case, I do not have an accidentally true belief about the number 5. I don't have a belief about it at all, accidental or not. If that were the case, sorry, that's a promissory note. While I can't give a further illuminating story about how my thinking about the number 5 hooks up with the truth of 5, other than just because I can have thoughts about the number 5, right? That's a condition of even the meaningfulness of the question or the debate. Would that answer the challenge, or just miss the point?
I mean, I think it might just push the challenge back. So if you say I can have thoughts, I mean, the question is, how can you, like, what? The question is about your justification for believing that you can have thoughts about the number 5.
But the question itself already presupposes someone's having thoughts about the number 5 here, right? If only to raise the question. So the presupposition of the intelligibility of the very question that the Benacerraf-Field challenge is trying to push, then while I don't have a more illuminating story to tell that they've been demanding, because I don't need them. story. Right? Because the challenge itself already presupposes the conditions for its meaningfulness. So sorry.
I mean, this is very like far from the way
Yeah.
I think about things, so I'm having a little trouble. So in what sense is it a presupposition of the challenge? Is it just that I'm allowing you to appeal to your own beliefs?
No, it's just that for me to count as having thoughts about the number 5,
Mhm.
or for you to be challenging, if the most basic arithmetic reasoning is not trustworthy in this respect, I don't know what's left of having thoughts about the number 5. I mean, there might be a number 5. Well, I don't know what it would be to say there still might be a number 5 out there or not. I mean, quite literally, I don't know what we're talking about anymore. And so the challenge isn't even because there's nothing to be challenged.
Okay, so isn't there, I mean, here isn't there a question of whether use an example, whether like King Arthur really existed?
Yes.
Okay, but I can refer to King Arthur. You know, let's suppose that King Arthur, that I can refer to King Arthur. Does that the fact that I can refer to King Arthur mean that the question's not open for me anymore?
No. Well, if I could then if I could then argue in all the best ways of establishing the reality of a historical figure, I don't know what those are, but even something that would be analogous to good arithmetic here. But if the question kept being pressed, right, but how, why, how do we know those aren't just bringing us to at best accidentally correct conclusions about, people in the past?
Mhm.
I think at a certain point you would get to the point of wondering, what are we talking about anymore with respect to people in the past? The question can be raised, so I think, line from Wittgenstein, the question can be raised, but insofar as it can be raised, in principle, it can be answered. When you run out of the resources for something that could, in principle, answer it, you've also run out of the space of the question to be pressed. And I take it Benacerraf-Field are trying to press a question here.
Yes, of course. I mean, I think I might be getting to the point, but so the difference between the King Arthur question or the question about the King Arthur and the number 5 is that we have methods for and I would describe those as doing the necessary work where and then what you're claiming, I think, is that, look, here's our best mathematical methods. Once we've applied those, there's nothing further to do or say about it.
Well, it's just if the result of those methods, if it's true, nevertheless counts as at best a lucky accident, right? Doesn't satisfy the condition.
Mm-hmm.
Then it looks like it's undermined its own intelligibility. What are we talking about when we're talking about 5 existing or not existing or 5? Right? What's left of this all seems to be a presupposition of the intelligibility of the dispute. And you could get to that with King Arthur too, although I take it the methods relevant to that are much more complicated and less sharply defined.
Yeah. So okay. So in that case, I have a couple of maybe let's say 1 or 2 things, and then Sharon had to follow. The first thing to say is that Field thinks that there is a challenge for like reference that works in broadly the same way as this epistemological challenge works. So he thinks that this is a worry about, and I don't know if that will work out, but so it might just he thinks that this question about whether we're even like that reference requires something that we don't have. So he might be happy with that claim. But I also think that, so separately from what our methods are, we have ways of referring to things. Sort of, we generate a description, and then sort of, this descriptive names, right? We generate a description, and then the dub, whatever it is that meets that description in the world as the number 5. And I think that, yeah, I mean, this is like Gareth Evans, Julius invented the zipper type of stuff. So we generate a description, and then we just say, well, insofar as there's anything meeting that description, it's the number 5. But then it still is an open question whether anything meets that description. Right?
I think there'll be, I think the problem is just, yet again, what counts as meeting the description.
Okay. Maybe I will.
That's fine.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I apologize, this is just a reformulation of the question of feasibility. But first, thank you for the talk. It was really insightful, explanatory. So if we take the right approach, the pragmatic approach,
Yep.
and if we begin it as like a project, and we don't necessarily have like we have a right to take on these cognitive projects, even if without absent a reason. When we embark on those projects, is it possible to, as we're doing those projects, begin like building up defeasibility standards, like because of success here, success there, predictability there. So like in the case of mathematics, it's so convinced Kant that he wanted to base all of knowledge on it. I'm not going to too strong a Kant claim in this room, but there's a sense of success that you get once you embark on the project. That does that, even though it begins from a sense of like risk and faith, can that kind of like, oh wow, this is actually pretty successful, and different variation, but then kind of build up. So you have to actually have a pretty good, like, it's not just now, once it's been successful, it's not just any old reason, absent of any reason. Given success, there might be, I need an average reason, or you might need a good reason, you might need a great reason. That then your metaphysical possibility one wouldn't really reach that standard, because it's so successful as we've been using it.
Yeah, I guess it depends on exactly what we're talking about when we talk about success. So, if it's a pragmatic success, then I don't think on this kind of view. Because I'll say it this way: the way that it's supposed to work is that you find whatever is sort of axiomatic or something for this cognitive project or this set of cognitive projects, and whatever reasons you have to believe anything are sort of parasitic on this presupposition. So it's hard to see how you would get like reason from that to believe the presupposition, because all the reasons you have are like with this presupposition presupposed. I don't know how to say it other than that, but I don't think that that's something that like Crispin Wright would say, but there might be a possible in that neighborhood. I'm not sure. Thank you.
Tim? Yeah, thanks, Brett. I wanted to take us all the way back to your move of requiring arc sensitivity of all beliefs. You introduced a couple of potential counterexamples, and then you suggested a way of batting those away, and I wanted to push back on that.
Okay.
So you said, right, the juror doesn't believe that she's being subjected to systematic conspiracy. When I believe that I have hands, I believe implicitly that I'm not subject to systematic perceptual deception. Falsely believe that I have hands. And then you suggested, well, these beliefs inherit their responsiveness to the facts, the more local beliefs. And It seems wrong to me to say that these more systematic beliefs are well, it certainly seems wrong to me to say that these more systematic beliefs are epistemically based on the corresponding beliefs. And I don't know if that was an assumption. It seems like they're kind of there in the background and articulated. Maybe they're not expressed beliefs, but there's a dependency there. The truth of these, and it seems like the epistemic, the dependency goes in the other direction. I was wondering if you could say more about it, because that seems like a key move. Because I guess that's to blow away the. Look, there are certain very foundational things that I don't believe and I don't need to satisfy the same standard.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I don't, yeah, it's a good question. I talk about it a little bit in the sensitivity paper, so I'm going to try to remember what I said in that paper. I don't think it's so what I mean to be doing there is all describable at a descriptive level. So I don't mean to be talking about epistemic basing. So what it is because we're taking for granted that I have sort of prima facie justification for believing all the things. So and I certainly am not trying to say that you're inferring from I have hands to I don't falsely believe that I have hands. I don't want to say that. So the thought is just this. The reason that there's this inherited connectedness or responsiveness is that, okay, again, all descriptive. So it's true that I have hands, okay? And any way for the world to be arranged on which I have hands is there, but thereby a way for the world to be arranged on which it's not the case that I falsely believe that I have hands. That's all just descriptive. And then because and then also I believe that there is this relationship of like sufficing, more or less, if you can call it entailment. And furthermore, I believe, so this is purely subjective, that whatever my grounds are for believing that I have hands, and my subjective grounds, so like psychological grounds, I'm not talking about like objective epistemological facts here. Whatever my grounds are, the subjective grounds on which I believe that I have hands, I also believe that those grounds suffice to ground the belief that I don't falsely believe that I have hands, because I also believe that insofar as I have hands, I don't falsely believe that I have hands. So it's all meant to be describable at a descriptive level and without appeal to any normative facts. And in that sense, and you can talk about what would happen if I came to believe, if I stopped believing that I have hands, and what effect that would have on the other belief, and kinds of things. But that's the idea, is that this is all describable as like facts about my psychology and facts about the world. There's no like normative stuff going on.
So the worry maybe is, okay, helping, but I'm still wondering, smuggled in here.
Okay.
So one might suppose that, granted, ordinary people aren't thinking about skeptical scenarios and so forth, beliefs as part of the justification for ordinary beliefs, but you might worry that my trust that my perceptual faculty, my trust in my perceptual faculty is part of my the epistemic ground. Some kind of epistemic commitment there that I weren't entitled to. And I do.
Yeah.
Thinking That's what I'm thinking, and then I'm thinking that's relevant to
So,
your,
yeah.
I'm just a little wondering how
Okay.
that business about epistemology, which you might reject,
No,
how that
it-
issue connects to this question of requiring our sense of
So, I mean, so I won't reject your epistemological like, but what I want to say is that the claims about epistemological basing are just there. This is a separate question. So this question about sensitivity has to do with a certain kind of defeat condition, and a defeat condition that having to do with becoming convinced that your belief is merely accidentally true, or that the truth of your belief is coincidental in some sense. And that is, again, supposed to be just a descriptive fact. So whether or not your belief, the truth of your belief is coincidental is supposed to be just a descriptive fact. And what you believe about that descriptive fact is supposed to have normative implications for defeat. But that's an important part of it.
independent second tier stage or
Yeah.
subject to defeasibility.
Yeah,
consideration.
yeah.
I see.
Yeah,
It's supposed to function independent.
So it need not, like, these questions about sensitivity and causal relationships and stuff need not be reflected in sort of epistemic basic relations for the argument to go, I think.
I think I need to think about it.
Sure.
Very
I want to phrase a question about whether or not first person sensitivity things really tracking what we're interested in, which is whether or not our stuff abstracta are reliable in some purpose sense or non-accidental. One might think, right off the bat that really what we want them to be non-accidental with respect to possible but not impossible ones. Why would impossible worlds have anything to do with whether or not our views are actually non-accidentally correct about abstract objects? But to give that a little more substance, you might think, well, the way to measure whether or not our beliefs about mathematical objects are non-accidentally true is to ask, whether or not, given the way we arrive at them, for the most part, they turn out to be true. Sometimes we do have false beliefs about mathematical objects when things get complicated and so on. So it's not as if we always get it right, but if the mechanism is such that we reliably, very reliably in the sense that most of the things we arrive at are true, and it's because of we develop it out of the ways we have of thinking about the objects. That's what guarantees their truth. So ways back to a thought that David was having. Then we have a story about why it's non-accidental, even though it turned out we're not first person sensitive. Maybe I have no idea actually how to get to the nearest impossible world. Supposing it turned out the way you thought. Still, we turn out not to be sensitive in that way, but we have a perfectly good story about why we're non-accidental. Beliefs about abstract objects.
Okay. Fair enough. So let me start by thinking we can think specifically about, okay, so what are our reliable methods here? We start with axioms and then do logic with them. So the question becomes, okay, what explains? Maybe here's a version. A question is, what explains how we have reliably picked out axioms that are true? Okay, and you might think that there's a story there, but I have, and maybe this is not fully responsive to what you're saying, but I have part of what you said is that what we really care about are the worlds that are in fact possible worlds. And I say things in this neighborhood in the paper version of this, but there's a worry about that, which is that there are many things that are sort of metaphysically impossible that are very clearly epistemically problematic or maybe not problematic, but let's see. I don't know. So a claim about the chemical structure of water, like a posteriori necessity. If we're wondering whether we have managed to get at the truth about this, what's relevant is whether the world we take ourselves to be in, the world where water is H2O, is in fact the world we are in. But in order to think about that question, you have to think about worlds that are metaphysically impossible on the assumption that our theory is true, right?
Well, I guess I want to say two things. One, I don't think natural kind terms are the model for mathematical terms or other terms referring to abstracta. And secondly, I would dispute the standard story about this being a posteriori necessities.
Okay. I have to think about it. Yeah, thank you.
I've already talked so much. It's of course, yes.
People that have further questions, follow-ups? I'd like to get my other question, and hopefully, the kind of big picture question, but just like get your quick reaction. So, what would you say to the Platonist? There's a kind of theoretical inference. The reason why we believe in Platonist objects is because there's a multi-stage theoretical inference from two Platonist objects from things that we all agree we're entitled to believe, and so forth. So we believe there are these truths. I think truths require truth bearers, and then now we begin to theorize what the nature of those truth bearers be. They're not false physical entities. Reason for ruling that out. They're not plausibly mind-dependent entities. That's not going to suffice. They're not plausibly contingent entities, because that would be make problematic our justification, things like that. So I'm not saying there's going to be these are all going to be debatable. You're systematically, by process of elimination, you're like, what are we left with? Well, we're left with necessary, non-spatiotemporal, essentially contentful truth bearers. And then there's and then there can be open question: are these Lewisian, structured concreta, or are these the traditional Platonist, reologically simple content bearers? But anyway, that's how it goes. That's why we believe in them. But the crucial thing is that first step is whatever story we all want to tell, right? All of us who believe that the Platonist starts with that very same story, and then it's just a kind of metaphysical
So I mean, I would be very worried about the inferences that got you from. So I'm happy to.
I mean, I think that's why. Let's say, what else can these things be?
Right. So, I mean, okay. But the question is, okay, we all agree that 2 + 2 = 4. Right. Once you've gotten to your theory, then you can ask yourself, okay, is the reason we all believe that 2 + 2 = 4 anything that has to do with, a realm of Platonic objects? The answer seems to be no. And if the answer is yes, then you're not a naturalist in the way that I'm describing. So you're not vulnerable to this version of the challenge.
Very sad for, I think he's being too wise to say, like, another answer, it might be the inference, this inference, the best explanation from 2 + 2 = 4, however you understand it, for Platonism, is provided in his forthcoming book, Descending the Kind of Conventionalism and Normalism. I don't believe it, but that is just out of context.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm just worried that that's a criticism on other grounds, and that's fine. I don't see this. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think
they're not subject to argument.
So I think that's true. But so I think this is, I was trying to be very careful to keep my focus narrowly on Platonists with these naturalistic inclinations. And I think if you give that up in any kind of way, then you're kind of okay. But then you don't really need an easy knowledge theory. So if there's some explanation of how we got to have we all came to agree that 2 + 2 = 4, that is to which abstract objects are like a relevant part of that explanation, then that's just not consistent with the kind of cognitive naturalism that I was presupposing.
I didn't mean to be running a follow that, but we'll talk.
Okay, well, yeah.
So let's all head together over to Maxwell Hall. We can continue the conversation there.